One of the greatest things about the competitive singles community is their preservation of older Pokemon metagames. There are strong communities for every single generation of overused, with active tournament scenes, and even a ranked ladder on Pokemon Showdown. The fact that I can queue up a competitive Gen 1 Pokemon game whenever I want for free is pretty awesome. Some older generation metagames are more obscure though. Old gen lower tiers don't have ranked ladders on Showdown. Some popular ones do have fairly active communities and tournament scenes, especially old gen Ubers formats, which are quite beloved. But something really obscure like Gen 2 ZU is going to have a very small player base. But there are formats even more obscure than this. Pokemon formats that used to be popular or representative of the current metagame that people moved on from and abandoned. If there's anyone still keeping these formats alive, they are few and far between. I'm talking about older iterations of Overused that were abandoned as soon as new content came out. The current version of Gen 3 Overused, playable on Showdown, is of course the most complete iteration of the games, with all the content from Emerald, Fire Red, and Leaf Green available. But there was once a competitive metagame for the original Ruby and Sapphire games before all this new content was added, and that metagame looked completely different. Pokemon movesets lacked key options, and significant metagame staples were completely unusable at the time. Pokemon such as Sceptile and Grumpig were much more viable than they are in current OU. The same is true of the Pokemon Diamond and Pearl metagame before the release of Platinum, Heart Gold, and Soul Silver. Pokemon Black and White 1 didn't even have the Therian forms yet, imagine that. Every generation of Pokemon has these older iterations of OU that most people have no real desire to preserve or return to. In Gen 8 and 9 there are multiple examples with DLC and Pokemon Home completely shifting the metagame multiple times. It does make sense though. Having separate formats for every single subset of every generation's Overused would be complicated and perhaps even divide the community. The most complete version of a Pokemon generation is also usually just the best in a competitive sense, with the most options available to players. But it is a shame sometimes to see these metagames completely lost to time and forgotten. Does anyone still play these lost metagames? Are there any old replays or footage of people playing them? Let's try and seek out anything we can about these Pokemon metagames lost to time. Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire before Emerald came out were played competitively back in the day on simulators like Net Battle, and this was an extremely different metagame. Staples of current Gen 3 OU like Aerodactyl, Tyranitar, Blissey, Suicune, Gengar, Dugtrio are just not here. And that makes for a completely different world. Dugtrio not being here has a significant impact, as Pokemon like Blaziken are much better as a result. Tyranitar, of course, not setting sand on the field means that weather strategies are much better, and as a result, you see Sunny Day Vileplume have a bit of a role, and Ludicolo with Swift Swim is much stronger. Skarmory still exists, and Skarmory is the best Pokemon in the whole format. Luckily, Magneton does exist to trap and eliminate Skarmory, and that's a central concept in the format. Metagross still exists in the format, but crucially, it cannot get Explosion, which is its best move, so it operates pretty differently. It's still very good, but it's much more limited due to a lack of Explosion. And since Blissey and Snorlax are both nowhere to be seen, Regice is actually the best special wall in this format. Regice is a top tier choice in Ruby and Sapphire OU. And Regice being so central makes for some interesting metagame developments. Because Regice is everywhere and it's so common, Grumpig is a viable Pokemon because Grumpig is a good Regice counter. Grumpig is one of the few things with access to Substitute. In original Ruby and Sapphire, way less Pokemon get Substitute, but Grumpig does. And Grumpig has Thick Fat, which grants Ice and Fire resistance, so Regice can substitute and Calm Mind against Regice, while also shrugging off its Ice-type stab and eventually 1v1ing this frightening special wall. I think Grumpig being an OU level Pokemon at one point is kind of funny. Also, Lantern is pretty good into Regice because Lantern, of course, is immune to Thunderbolt and resists Ice Beam, and Regice commonly uses the Bolt Beam combo. Lantern is also loving the fact that Dugtrio doesn't exist, as Dugtrio does significantly punish Lantern in Gen 3 OU. There is significantly less counterplay to Sleep in this format because Sleep Talk is a very uncommon move and Aromatherapy is pretty much non-existent here. As a result, this is a very aggressive metagame. Sleep users are very good More choice Pokemon are viable and powerful because they're not getting chipped by Sandstorm. Choice Band Dodrio, for example, is pretty good. So it's much more aggressively focused than current Gen 3 OU, and it feels completely different. There's a great article on Smogon about this Ruby and Sapphire metagame, written by Iku Chimonji and Blue Kirby. I would urge you to check that out, it's where I'm getting much of this information. And there's also a Smogon thread about it. Today, the format seems very inactive. It has been played a little bit just as a novelty. It's kind of interesting to try here and there, and I believe the YouTuber Reverend did host some ADV200 tournaments just out of curiosity and to gather some data about the metagame, which is very cool, but it's not very active and it's mostly forgotten. Gen 3 OU does feel like there's more playstyles viable, there's more options, there's more going on. ADV200 is a little bit more one-dimensional, it's fast-paced, clicking buttons, and a lot of stuff just has less moves to choose from, which restricts variety, but it does look like a pretty interesting format that I would like to try out in the future possibly. And it is extremely distinct from Gen 3 OU. It's totally different, and I think that's really cool. Even though ADV200 is not very active anymore and is certainly pretty unpopular, at least some people have been willing to try it, and many are aware of its existence, but the Pokemon Diamond and Pearl metagame, you can't really say the same. I could not find any evidence of people still playing Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, but this was a very distinct metagame, before Platinum and before Heart Gold and Soul Silver. In Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, a lot is different. The biggest thing, and my favorite, is that Jirachi cannot learn Iron Head because Iron Head is a move tutor option from Pokemon Platinum. It also can't get Fire Punch, which is very significant. The Rotom forms do not exist yet in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, which is also a big deal because they're some of the best Pokemon in the game. The Rotoms are key Pokemon on defensive teams and they're the best ghost types in the game. Salamence was legal back when Diamond and Pearl was current, and it didn't even have Outrage yet, so it was a little bit more balanced, perhaps. And another significant thing that didn't exist yet was that Scizor did not have Bullet Punch, its best move, the move that defines it. Platinum is when it got Bullet Punch. Another random thing that was different in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl specifically is that for whatever reason, Hypnosis was buffed to have 70 accuracy just in Diamond and Pearl. As soon as Platinum came out, they changed it back to 60 accuracy, but for a brief period, there were way more Pokemon with access to an accurate sleep move. Notably, Gengar could just Hypnosis you. It still can, but 70 accuracy is way better than 60. Sleep is a famously imbalanced mechanic that needs a lot to keep it in check, and when the widely distributed Hypnosis is more accurate, that probably creates even more issues for Sleep. It's hard to say how this metagame would look today because there hasn't been any developments for it. Nobody plays it. Back then, a lot was still undiscovered and not optimized yet. People were still using Electivire and stuff like that, so it would be interesting to see how people play Pokemon Diamond and Pearl OU, but it is difficult to get people to rally behind such a format. You would have to change the mechanics quite a bit to even create the format itself, and I don't know if there's much desire to play such a format. There is a small community I found for Pokemon Platinum OU, which is also a little bit different to Heart Gold Soul Silver, the current version of Gen 4 OU. In Pokemon Platinum OU, we did receive Bullet Punch on Scizor, all of the Rotom forms, and Jirachi with Iron Head, which of course changed everything forever. But there is still quite a bit different. When Pokemon Platinum was current, Salamence was still legal. Salamence didn't get banned until the Heart Gold Soul Silver metagame. And there are some other differences, like Dragonite not getting extreme speed quite yet, and overall pretty minor moveset differences, like Donphan does not get Head Smash, Celebi does not get Nasty Plot, and some other small ones. The most noteworthy is probably Scizor not getting Bug Bite yet, and certain Pokemon like the Evolutions not receiving Heal Bell quite yet. There is a Smogon thread for a Pokemon Platinum metagame with a Discord attached. I checked the Discord and I could not find any evidence of anyone playing a game of this. There's no replays in this server at all, so I don't know if anyone actually plays this. And to be honest, it's a bit weird that you would have a community for Platinum and not Diamond and Pearl, which is more of a distinct metagame. Platinum is mostly the same as current Heart Gold Soul Silver. The only real difference is the unbanning of Salamence. But yeah, it's interesting to look back at previous states of Generation 4 competitive and how it looked back in the day. Generation 5 is probably an example where the current day metagame looks absolutely different to what it was when it was current. Even Black and White 2 OU back when it was current was very different because of bans that have happened since. But Black and White 1 OU was a whole different beast. The Therian forms were not in the game yet, and that's probably the most significant. Thundurus and Landorus Therian are both incredible Pokemon central to the Gen 5 metagame, and they simply didn't exist yet. Keldeo also did not exist. And Keldeo is the best of its legendary quartet, and also one of the best Pokemon in Gen 5 OU to this day, just not existing whatsoever. The other big one is Kyurem Black, not existing yet in Black and White 1. Kyurem Black is one of the best Dragon-type wall breakers in the tier, and it's not quite as good as the Therians and Keldeo, but it was a significant addition. It's an incredible Pokemon on Dragon Spam offense teams and other general hyper-offense strategies. Even like a sub-Roost set is good in certain contexts. It's a great Pokemon alongside Magnezone to eliminate Steel types. There is a Smogon thread for this format, for Black and White 1, and more people play this than probably any other of the lost metagames so far. This is a pretty popular one, and you can understand why. It looks totally different to current Gen 5. It is pretty distinct, and many people remember playing this version of Gen 5. So it does make some sense why this is popular. And what's cool about this is that the Black and White 1 OU community that exists today have unbanned many of the things that are currently banned in Gen 5 OU. Most notably, Chlorophyll and Sandrush are both unbanned, and these once defined the generation and its weather wars. Venusaur Sun teams with Chlorophyll were popular, as were Stoutland Sandrush teams. Excadrill was of course banned, as it was too powerful in the Sandstorm with Sandrush, but Stoutland was used. Sleep is unbanned, for better or for worse. This is true to how Black and White 1 was. Sleep was not banned back then, so I suppose they're trying to preserve the history of the format by unbanning it. Sleep is really broken in Gen 5 because when you switch out, it doesn't reset your sleep counter, so it's really difficult to actually wake Pokemon up as a result, but that's what we played with back then, so I suppose I agree with unbanning it for this, for history's sake. Gems are unbanned. Gems getting banned was very recent, but of course for most of Gen 5's life, the gem items were completely legal. Cloyster is unbanned, of course. That was also a recent one, and that was undone. And interestingly, Landorus Incarnate and Deoxys Defense are both unbanned in this format too. Both incredibly powerful Pokemon that were in fact legal back during Black and White 1. And finally, there's a lot of these, isn't there? It's a very different format, as you could tell, but trapping effects like Shadow Tag and Arena Trap are also unbanned. And this, I remember playing with Wobbuffet back in the day on Pokemon Showdown. This is true. Shadow Tag was once completely legal. So there you go. This is a pretty accurate metagame to how Black and White 1 was played back in the day, and it's a pretty interesting one too. Terrakion is significantly better in this format than it is in current Gen 5 OU without Landorus Therian and Keldeo to worry about. Sun teams are of course much better because they can use Chlorophyll. In current Gen 5, Sun teams are pretty unviable, but here they are better. So if you want to play a version of Gen 5 where the old weather wars that once defined the generation are still in effect, maybe give this a go. Whether this is better or worse than current Gen 5 OU is probably just a matter of opinion. Current Gen 5 OU is more aggressive with banning things because they're trying to reach a balanced state. All of this stuff was incredibly broken and infamous. People did hate this generation, remember. Especially in its most broken state, where weather dominated, sleep was broken, gems were broken, everything was broken. It's the most divisive, the most chaotic format we've ever seen in competitive Pokemon history. But at the same time, even I sometimes miss how Gen 5 once was, so it is cool that this is preserved in some form. And the Gen 5 I remember is still playable today. In later gens, it does become less and less desirable to return to older versions of formats. I don't know why anyone would return to Pokemon Sun and Moon OU when Ultra Sun and Moon OU is not even that different, to be honest. But X and Y OU is a little bit different. There is no real community for this format. It's lost to time. But back when XY was current, things were different. Aegislash and Genesect and the broken Megas were briefly allowed, like Mega Gengar, for example, was briefly legal, as was Mega Salamence. A lot of key Megas were not in the game yet. A pretty significant amount. Mega Sableye was not yet introduced. Mega Altaria was not yet introduced. Probably the most significant were the lack of Mega Metagross and Mega Lopunny in the game. Pokemon X and Y OU lacked Contrary Superior that was added to the game in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, and some small move pool differences as well, like Weavile not getting Icicle Crash yet. It's kind of interesting to look back to, and there are old tournament replays you can take a look at from back in 2014 and 15, but I don't really ever see a community forming around Pokemon X, Y, OU, especially because a lot of the stuff added in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire was really cool, like Mega Lopunny, Mega Metagross, who are really nice central Pokemon that most people enjoy, Mega Gallade as well, Mega Altaria, like all the cool Megas came out in ORAS, so why would you return to X, Y, OU really? And from Gen 8 onwards, things get even more complicated because there are many lost formats in these generations. Both Gen 8 and 9 launched in a state before Pokemon Home compatibility, so that was its own metagame with very limited options. Pokemon Home releases adding more content from previous iterations in the franchise, expanding move pools, and then both Gen 8 and 9 have had DLC, which added significant new Pokemon as well. I sincerely doubt that anyone will return to any of these previous iterations of Gen 8 and 9. It's kind of complicated because what do you even call them? Pre-Home OU, pre-DLC OU. That's not to say these metagames were bad though. In fact, I remember speaking with McMagan, a fantastic Pokemon player, who said that he actually preferred Gen 9 in its pre-Pokemon Home state when there were less options in the game, and after a couple bans took place and the metagame was pretty balanced right before Pokemon Home dropped. And then of course all the new content shifted everything around and we had to almost start from scratch with balancing the format. I don't know if I would agree. I think Gen 9 in its current state right now is probably more interesting with way more options in the game. These Gen 8 and 9 metagames before Pokemon Home and DLC were extremely limited. There was sometimes almost no variation in team structures, and for the most part these lost metagames do just feel like worse versions of the final product. But there are exceptions to this. I think the biggest exceptions would be Black and White 1 OU and the ADV200 metagame, which are extremely distinct formats. Both of these formats lack metagame defining Pokemon that were introduced in the next installment, which makes for a totally unique experience with different central Pokemon and completely different strategies used. They're almost unidentifiable from one another despite being in the same generation. What is your favorite of these lost metagames? I'm probably most curious about Pokemon Diamond and Pearl OU just because it sounds interesting and it would look very different. There's just not many people who seem to want to play it. But as for the ones that are more active, I'd probably say Black and White 1, even though that format looks like complete chaos. That's the Gen 5 I remember, and I think that this is a cool metagame to preserve in history that looks the most different to its modern counterpart out of all of these, I would say. Black and White 1 was a whole different beast. But what do you think, folks? Let me know down below in the comments, and thank you for watching.